Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a special video here on the Sports Daily Media Network YouTube channel. I'm your host, Sean Vowells. I'm joined by Joe Meade. We're talking about Mike Woodson and the Indiana Hoosiers tonight, Joe, and not for good reason. It seemed like last night, we're filming this on Wednesday, January 15th, it seemed like last night may have been the point of no return. And there's been a lot of negatives coming up to this from Woodson and Indiana, and we'll get to all of it in this video. But, Joe, just 10 days ago, Indiana was 4-1 in the Big Ten, coming off of a quad one victory against Penn State on the road. Since then, they've had probably their worst two-game stretch in our lifetime, certainly maybe ever, a 25-point road loss to Iowa, and then nearly a 30-point home loss to Illinois. But, Joe, before we get into the long-term look-away view from this, what did you see from the Hoosiers in the last two games?
I didn't see much of anything good, and what I heard was even more troubling for the fans, and for all the people that say the fans don't matter. I promise you, with the NIL era and all these donors that are becoming probably way too influential in both football and basketball, they matter a lot, and you could debate me whether that's right or wrong. The fact is they do, and what I've seen so far, I was telling Sean off air, I couldn't believe Indiana was 1-5 in these quad one games. And let's face it, Sean, aside from the Nebraska game, and that game ended a 17-point loss, I know it was close. Most of these losses have looked pretty lifeless, to be completely honest with you, Sean.
The average margin of defeat is 21 points in quad one games right now. And the only one you had was a road game not at the team's actual arena with 25% Indiana fans. So, yeah. But, yeah, quad one, the Bahamas, those first two games were quad one, easily swept aside, and both those, Nebraska, Iowa, and Illinois at home, swept aside. Not even close.
Yeah, and, one thing I found particularly troubling in the Iowa game was you kind of know what Iowa's going to do. They're going to pop threes at any point. It seemed like Indiana didn't even prep. I was amazed. I mean, I'm no stranger to seeing Iowa make contested threes. I don't think any fan in this conference, if you've been a fan, aside from the new schools, if you've been a fan for more than 3 years, everyone knows what Fran McCaffrey's teams will do against you, or what they will try to do against you. It's almost as if Indiana didn't watch any of that, and all these new transfers haven't watched a lick of Big Ten basketball, certainly not Iowa basketball. Because it legitimately looked like, Sean, that Iowa, I know they came in as 5.5-point favorites. It seemed like a mid-major game. That's the kind of pace and the kind of vibe Indiana had in that game. And to follow it up with last night against Illinois, to be losing by 28 at halftime, and 28 was egregious because, as you mentioned, Sean, how long a scoring drought did Illinois have?
Illinois had a 3-minute scoring drought and still scored 60 points in 20 minutes.
Yeah.
1.77 points per possession.
Yeah.
And we'll go back to the Iowa game for a second here, Joe. Iowa does throw the first punch, but Indiana actually responded pretty well to that initial punch and got it back. They actually had the lead, a 3-point lead after an Umar Ballo dunk, 26-23. So it seemed like, all right, well, this team is actually ready to play. Maybe it took a media timeout screaming at them to show up, but it looks like they'll be here. And then the defense just fully fell apart, and then when they start missing shots, clearly affects their defense, but it all snowballed really quickly. They end up going into the half down 10, and then again, just like coming out of the locker room slow in the first half, they're down big early in the second half. 10 points is such an interesting deficit to be down at halftime, right? Because if you win that first segment and you're down by 6 with 16 minutes left, it's a ball game. It could go either way. If you're down 14 or 16, you're chasing and you're trying to pull something off that'll probably not happen in all likelihood. Now, this hasn't always been a problem. Indiana had a 14-0 run out of the half against Penn State. So clearly something changed since then. And after Indiana gets punched in the face by Iowa, You get Illinois coming into your house, a great opportunity to go to 5-2 in the Big Ten, get another Q1 win, and the same thing happens. You get punched in the face early, you sort of kind of punch back and make it a game, and then all of a sudden it was 30 points before halftime. The team was booed off the floor. Chants of fire Mike Woodson came in, and it was a pretty ugly scene. Probably one of the ugliest at Assembly Hall in my lifetime. There were a lot of nasty things said about Tom Crean and Archie Miller. Joe, I'm not sure it ever reached this level.
Especially with this talent on this team. I don't want to make this the bigger picture part of this conversation quite yet, but this was a team that was probably picked, of all the major outlets, probably second or third of this conference. A lot had them winning too, and for good reason, especially with that transfer portal Hall class they got. I mean, just remembering our podcast in late April, early May, talking about, who had a better acquisitions, Dusty May, Jake Diegler, or Mike Woodson. The consensus was Mike Woodson pretty heavily, except maybe USC because their whole roster transfers. But really, Sean, you added that in with the guys returning. And this is a team, I thought by mid-January, we'd be talking about top 25 and maybe a protected seed. This has gone completely off the rails, and just as a neutral, I think it went off the rails starting in the Bahamas. That kind of told me Indiana was not going to be elite. I thought I would give them the benefit of the doubt until January. And, after the Penn State game, I thought I was smart to do that. But these last two games have been lifeless. And if you look at the greater, I guess, totality of it, the 6 games, the fact 5 of those were not competitive, and you added the fact that they're not really blowing. They started to blow out these bad teams at the beginning of the year, but how much stock are you really putting in if you're going to get blown out by the big boys anyway?
Yeah, and it's the Bahamas. There is a way that you can write off a bad MTE performance. Look at UConn; they're still a good team, but when these things pile up, they can't really be written off together. And the Bahamas was a sign, Joe. There were signs even last year and the year before. So now let's take a bigger look at this one. Mike Woodson is hired in 2022 after Archie Miller is fired after going 0 for 4 in NCAA tournaments. Well, really 0 for 3 because they would have made the tournament in the year there wasn't one, but still likely to be a 10 seed or something along those lines. At his introductory press conference, a little bit less ceremonious than Kurt Signetti's, but he said, I'm coming back to bring championships to Indiana, whether that's Big Ten or national championships. Now, Joe, they haven't had a team anywhere close to either of those. They did have a team come in second place in 2023, but they were 3 games behind a Purdue team that they swept. So really not anywhere close to really either of those goals so far, and it seems like it's getting further and further away.
Sean, and really the first 2 years, the highlights were beating Purdue pretty often, and I think
3-1 in the first 2 years.
Yeah, and I don't want to discount the rivalry. I think rivalries are what makes college basketball and football go round. But at the same time, Sean, the 23 squad was a game away from finishing in 7th. Now, that's more of a consequence of the Big Ten that year being as jam-packed as it was toward the middle and the middle class. But Indiana, following that game, was pretty disgraceful. Miami, would you even consider that round of 32 game all that competitive?
I mean, no, but I want to go back to year 1 first, Joe. Mm-hmm. Really, the goal in year 1 was to get back to the tournament, and you have a player in Trace Jackson Davis who is now in the NBA. You're able to bring in some nice transfers in Miller Kopp, Xavier Johnson, and they did that because they came back from a huge deficit against your Michigan Wolverines in the tournament, and then they parlayed that with a victory against the number 1 seeded Michigan Wolverines. Illinois.
Illinois, yeah.
So they really backdoored their way into that tournament by playing really well late in the year. They end up getting a win in the first 4 and then getting absolutely smoked by St. Mary's. Now, the NCAA did mess up a plane for Indiana, and they didn't sleep the night before the game. So, again, you can excuse that if you will. But year 2 for Woodson had a ton of returnees. Trace Jackson-Davis comes back for his senior year. You have Race Thompson as a senior. You have Miller Kopp as a senior. You have Xavier Johnson as a senior. You have five-star Jalen Hood-Schifino coming in. And, Joe, this was the team that was supposed to win the league. And they ultimately didn't. Like you said, they weren't that close to Purdue. They were more so the best team of the middle of the pack than the second-best team in the league. And I still do think they underachieved here. I have the Torvik stats from all 4 years here. They actually finished worse off in the analytics than the year before. Now, they did have a couple really nice road wins that year to get that protected seed. But still, with the preseason expectations, that was an underachievement.
Absolutely, Sean. And one quick thing, because I know you want to keep going off, which I'm really enjoying. But I want to say, that team most of the year was ranked within the top 15 for a large majority of it. When you're ranked that high and the analytics were what they were, you'd expect Indiana, especially with the vibe around that program year two, was still exciting, was still veteran presence. That's the kind of team that should get you back to the Sweet 16 for the first time since 2016. I don't want to talk about the Final Four drought because that's just easy to pick apart, and that speaks for itself. But at the same time, Sean, that had to be a failure with everything in totality, not just the preseason expectations. Up to February, you thought that Indiana team was a Sweet 16 team. And to not come close against Miami, which I know I just brought up again, that has to be not necessarily the law. I'd give that a C- at best if you're grading on a traditional scale. Just getting blown out by Miami, not winning the Big Ten, and really not doing much in the Big Ten tournament either, right?
I think that was the semifinal loss to Shrewsbury's Penn State team.
Yes.
That won a bunch of games. But
still,
they had to win one game.
Game.
They had to win one game to get there. Now, they did make two semifinals in the first 2 years of the Big Ten tournament, which hadn't happened in a very long time. But I think after 2 years, Joe, you see maybe the defense wasn't quite as good in year two, and that's why they didn't quite reach the heights that they wanted to. But still, after 2 years, you had to think that Indiana was in a good spot as a program. Back-to-back years in the tournament, you're 3-1 over your rivals in the last 2 years. You've competed, you got into semifinals in the Big Ten tournament. You're winning a bunch of games at home. It seemed like after 2 years, this was going pretty well.
Yeah, I lost you for a slight second.
All right, well, I just asked you, Joe, after 2 years, you had to think that this was going pretty well.
Absolutely, Sean. And, the real scary part is I think I reminded you, and we could go back to the archives and find this. After the loss to Miami, I grilled you pretty hard on if this season was a success for Indiana. I don't think you said it was a resounding success. I don't even think you called it that good of a season. What I remember was you thought you guys were on the right track. And I was a bit skeptical, but I really was in the minority there. I really believed that in current college basketball, with the experience Indiana had, I thought they missed a major opportunity.
You're back, Joe. You're back.
Yeah. And 23-24 would be not a major step back, which is what it ended up being in reality, but maybe more of a team that wasn't going to be a 4 or 5 seed, perhaps more of the 9-10 seed type. And, Sean, I'm going to lead you right into year 3, I guess, if you don't have anything else.
And I think year 2, like, if you make the tournament enough and you're good every year, you can say, oh, well, you ran into a Miami team that wasn't a very good matchup and clearly got hot and made the Final Four and nearly went to the national championship game. But that was just a reminder of modern basketball versus old school, and old school just wasn't able to keep up. But, Joe, here's where I think it really went wrong, is the transition into year 3. A lot of veteran leaders from this team left the program. Graduation, Hood-Schifino goes to the draft with Trace, and they never really replaced that leadership. Woodson in the NBA, you don't have to tell. There's a lot of teaching. There's fundamentals and stuff. You don't have to do that in the NBA. And he didn't have to do it for this team because they were all senior veterans who've played 100 games of college basketball and a lottery pick freshman. Now, last year's team was just built poorly. Again, Woodson should have known better. The team still should have got to the tournament. And they were an awful team, really. 10-10 was a record that they were very lucky to get. They played a lot of the teams near the bottom of the league. They still got crushed by every good team that they played. They weren't able to score, and they weren't able to defend quite enough. They didn't make free throws. Kind of all of the above of teams that you think could win, but they never replaced those leaders, and I think it's still evident today that that 23 team that was really good, 12-8, the 4 seed, was a player-led team, and those leaders were awfully good at keeping each other in check.
100% shot, and of course it's easier for us to say that in hindsight, but based on the way Indiana started last year, and there was really no point in the season last year where you believe this team, and we did this all last year, where you believe this team was getting into March Madness, barring a major run in the Big Ten tournament. I think a lot of enthusiasm for the program went down, which is why Woodson, I don't want to skip ahead, but I just want to make this a talking point here. That's probably why Woodson and the boosters and everyone behind the scenes there went in so hard in the portal this year. They saw, I don't think this originally was a make or break year because of the expectation that this team was at least going to make the tournament and perhaps compete and win the Big Ten. But they saw that the tide was turning in terms of enthusiasm. And, with Purdue finally breaking that glass ceiling, getting to the championship game, I think they knew they had to go all in this year. And unfortunately, we're doing this podcast, and I don't think the title is going to be all that nice.
And Joe, I think year 3, if the other 3 years were good, could be written off as you really just didn't have a good roster, and that's on you. But that's certainly not the problem this year. Now, we transition into year 4. There were a lot of rumors about conversations that were had at the university that Woodson was given sort of a chance to retire and didn't, and wanted another chance to get this thing back on track. He certainly had the support of the boosters, and they have one of the top 10 most expensive rosters in the league. Now, Joe, this is an idea for another video, but the teams that did similar things, Kansas State, St. John's, Kansas to an extent, all kind of underachieving. But that's another video. We've got Miles Rice, Cannon Carlisle coming in, Umar Ballo, and then you were able to retain actually a couple of your good players from last year, and the team was, top, I think, 14th in the initial poll. Bahamas comes around, like we mentioned, not good. It's clear that this team is not connected. They're not playing defense very well. They can make some shots at a better rate than they did a year before, and they'll probably end up a better team than the year before, unless it really totally crashes off the rails. But it was pretty clear early on this year that this team wasn't as good as the initial AP poll thought. And before we get to where we are now, it really was clear that building a roster this way doesn't work.
Not at all, Sean. And if anything, I thought the Bahamas would serve as maybe just a wake-up call to re-experiment the lineups and roster. And I think they did it for a decent amount in December. But it kind of was just like putting Band-Aid on something that needs to be taken to the doctor. And unfortunately, there's not a doctor on staff, or he's not giving authorization to cure this team, because it's gotten worse. And like the floor, I'll put it to you this way, Sean. I think the floor of this team is probably as bad as it was last year. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think, Joe, with the schedule up there, with the rest of the way, the schedule for Indiana, I would not be surprised if they lost every game. Now, I think they will win a couple, but in a one-game sample size, I wouldn't be surprised if they lost that game, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely.
When the ball tips, we wouldn't be surprised if they lose that game. They're 61st in Torvik right now. I think a couple spots worse in KenPom. And, it really seems like that Illinois game, Joe, was an inflection point on the season. And the ugly scenes at Assembly Hall, it seemed like that was the point of no return, as I started off saying in the beginning here. And before we move on, do you see any way that this is salvaged?
I think the next two games, and I hope you guys are listening before Friday's tip off in Columbus. I think that provides a phenomenal opportunity. Get a quad 1A win against a Ohio State team that we just talked about on the In a Nutshell for this week for basketball. They're a team that's really close in a lot of games, and the numbers love Ohio State, and they've been, like I said, they should have beaten a lot of top teams, whether that's Pittsburgh, whether that's uh, Wisconsin, or even you know they slaughtered Kentucky for a reason, right? If they win that game or win the Northwestern game handily, I think you could not necessarily buy back in, but just not cover your eyes like you have been the last two games. But I think if those two games are ugly, they only have like four of their remaining, I believe, four of their remaining 13 games are against quad two. Every other game is quad one. And to be honest with you, Sean, looking at this, all the away games they have, even some of the home games like against Michigan and against Purdue, it's hard for me to see them be favored in more than three or four of these games, which is kind of crazy.
So here's the conversations that reportedly happened today, Joe. Um, that there's a number of different ways that they can go here. They're likely against an in-season change here. First of all, because none of the other assistants they think can take the job. None of them have head coaching experience. So I think it's likely that we'll see some sort of stepping down from Woodson, which he'll still get his buyout and he'll save the public humiliation. But it's pretty clear at this point from the rumors that I've been seeing today that Mike Woodson will not be the coach of this team next year. And a lot of Indiana fans are probably cheering at that, but it is truly sad the fact that that had to happen yesterday for that to be realized. But Joe, I don't think you disagree with that, but at this point, I think it's pretty clear to me.
I think barring a crazy midseason turnaround, and perhaps this will be one of the most freezing cold takes video in the history of the internet if Indiana does turn it around, because I do think the ceiling of this team is still really high, but I just see no indication they'll reach it.
Do you think though, Joe, if this team is a 10 seed in the NCAA tournament, that's really turning it around?
No, I think, that's you're underachieving your initial prognosis at the beginning of the year, and more importantly, you're kind of relegating Indiana, which is the blue blood of the Big Ten. Maybe UCLA now that they just moved in, but truly the blue blood of the traditional Big Ten. You're relegating them to being a team that celebrates March Madness appearances. I don't think that's really what Indiana or their fan base, and especially their boosters, is willing to denote themselves at quite yet.
And I think I don't think it's likely, but there is a way that this team wins enough games to make the tournament. We talked about how weak the bubble is in our other video. This team is an incredibly talented individual set of individuals. I just think that even if that does happen, that's still a massive underachievement, and that should be treated as such. So in the 99% world that Woodson is relieved of his duties next year, Joe, and there is an opening in Bloomington, obviously there's a lot of names that have already been floating around with the likely possibility of this happening. But from a neutral point of view, who do you think their first call should be?
I know who it's going to be, and I really hope that this guy tells them to bleep off and a whole lot worse. And that's Indiana Hoosier alum Dusty May. Was a manager under Bobby Knight, and you listen to any interview about Dusty May, he's either asked it or he credits Coach Knight for a lot of tendencies, certainly not to throw in the chair, but a lot of how he runs his offense, a lot of how he preps for games, and how he preps for practice. That has to be the number one realistic option. You're going to have some message board warriors throw Brad Stevens, probably throw
Bruce Pearl.
Billy Donovan, Bruce Pearl. Wouldn't even shock me if they threw I don't know, like Dan Hurley. If you're talking to me about those names, I think we're in an entirely different universe. I couldn't even comprehend that at this stage. I think Dusty May would be the first call, but outside of that, Sean, it's really hard to see any true clear-cut candidates. I think some of the guys Michigan looked at last year, the Nico Medveds of the world, is that high caliber of a hire for Indiana? They kind of went mid-major with their last two of their last three, whether that was Tom Crean or whether that was Archie Miller. This is a program that needs a slam dunk hire. I thought that last time, and of course we didn't do the podcast, so you're just gonna have to take me at my word. I thought last time Indiana had to go all in on someone major, and I think Mike Woodson, while I didn't hate the hire at first because of the pedigree and
He was
certainly
like the sixth choice by all reports.
yeah, but particularly because of the success the Jawan Howard era was having at that point in 2021 at Michigan, and the potential Penny Hardaway had at um, Memphis. You have to remember, in 2021, the kind of guys going back to their alma mater doing bad. The Ewings and the Mullins were argued with the Jawans and the Pennies. The Jawans and the Pennies at that point did well enough for that argument to be dismissed, but now that argument's looking even more of a it's kind of looking like a certainty at this point now. I think there's micro instances that could change, but Sean, the fact I can't name any major candidates that I find realistic, let alone good enough for Indiana and their boosters, is pretty scary. Now, will they hire someone good or someone who is high profile? Probably. I don't see any major jobs coming open this cycle, except maybe UNC, but even then, I doubt it.
Nah, they're playing well enough in a terrible league that'll
Yeah.
stay closed.
Mhm.
But I don't think they really need a slam dunk hire, Joe. I think they just need a solid coach. I mean, with the resources at Indiana, a solid coach probably has them in the tournament every single year. I mean, and there's a bunch of names out there. I actually think Stevens will be the first call. I know he's been the first call the last two times. He has said no. His kids are a little older now. One of them is on the Notre Dame basketball team, potentially moving out of Massachusetts with the sale of the Celtics. I'd give it 1 or 2% more than I did last time. I think call two is Dusty May. You got to hope that he's not too comfortable in Ann Arbor. By all accounts, Indiana could have got him last year and didn't. Clearly, Louisville wanted May too. I think it's pretty clear he would have chosen Indiana out of those three, especially considering he chose Michigan over Louisville, which not many would have expected at that point last year. And then after that, Joe, you got to get creative. You're right. There's not a lot that come to mind.
TJ Otzelberger, maybe.
Yeah.
Fred Hoiberg.
I really like Fred Hoiberg. I think he's a solid coach. I wouldn't be disappointed with that. I think Tucker DeVries is the player. Darian DeVries is a good choice. 1 year at West Virginia. And then you've got the super outside the box hires like Chris Mack at Charleston or Todd Golden at Florida. Like you're really grasping at straws here, but
I think an underrated one, Sean. Sorry to cut you off. I just thought of this. Maybe Mick Cronin at UCLA. I don't think with the press conferences he's doing
look,
the greatest job.
He might take the first chance to get out of there.
But that's what I've been saying, Sean. You hear all the rumors. His name was thrown around there a bit for the Michigan and Ohio State search because of his history at Cincinnati. I'll put it to you this way. I don't think Mick Cronin, if he was offered that job, would have to think that he's getting any better offers than that in terms of program stature and in terms of geographical fit. So definitely a need to be thrown in the ring. I don't think Indiana's quite at that stage yet where I think they're definitely not going to have Woodson. Whether they fire him immediately, I think I'm highly doubtful that they make this change before March 2025 is a thing. So
And Joe, last time around, there were a lot of names that were floated. You talk about Thad Matta was a real candidate at one point. John Beeline was a real candidate at one point. And clearly they called Ohio State at the time and asked Chris Holtmann to take it, and he said no. Stevens was obviously the first no. So they clearly went down the list. And clearly, maybe Woodson wasn't the worst of that bunch. Mata's not doing a whole lot at Ohio State. Clearly, Holtmann has gotten fired from the job he was at. So the only positive from this, Joe, is you have to give Indiana Athletic Director Scott Dolson the benefit of the doubt when making this hire because he absolutely crushed the football hire that was made 12 months ago.
With Kurt Signetti, 1,000%. And one thing I'll say is Indiana, in terms of Directors Cup standing, and people roll your eyes at this all you want. The teams that do best in that in the Big Ten are the Michigans, the Penn States, the UCLAs, Ohio State as well. Indiana's right up there. They're above a lot of schools you'd think might be about have a superior athletic program. Some of the Wisconsins of the world, the Iowas and whatnot. So I'd give Indiana athletics the benefit of the doubt. One other thing, the one glimmer of hope for Dusty May is Warren Manuel has let 4 Hall of Fame or at least elite coaches walk out the door. Eric Bakich in baseball, Jim Harbaugh in football, John Beilein in basketball, and Mel Pearson in hockey. So, what's one more to that list? The Mount Rushmore might turn into the Fab Five, but not the good kind of Fab Five. So that's one glimmer of hope for Dusty. But I do think this kind of job, especially in this cycle where I don't think the Kentuckys of the world nor the Kentuckys, the Louisvilles will be opening up. I really believe that this should be the premier job and could attract some names out of the woodwork you didn't even imagine.
And Joe, I think it's time to wrap this one up. We've been saying the same point over and over again, but the thing that I will end off with is the blue blood conversation here. It is pretty clear that the brand of Indiana is still regarded at the very top. And it doesn't matter where you go to watch a game. I've seen Indiana games in D.C., New York City, Philadelphia. The brand is there. It is still there. Anyone saying that it's not is just lying. The program, on the other hand, is not. They're not acting like a championship program. Frankly, they haven't acted like one since Mike Davis was the coach, on a consistent level. There's been years. Tom Crean clearly had a couple of really good teams there, but when the recruiting slowed down, so did the results. But if you want to be regarded as a championship program, you got to start acting like it. The brand is there. The resources are there. It won't take a crazy rescue job to get this thing on track in year one. Look at what Dusty May just did in Michigan. Pretty bad situation by all measurements for the caliber of Team Michigan was. You had lost your football coach. The team was going through a really rough patch. Look where they are in year one. If you don't think Dusty can rescue Indiana, he certainly can. But that's what I'll leave him off with, Joe, is that the brand is still there. The resources are still there. It won't take anything ridiculously crazy to get Indiana back on track.
I completely agree, Sean. And, hopefully for your sake and Hoosier Nation's sake, this video might become irrelevant soon if Indiana can rattle off some wins. But early indications from both of us is that's not likely at all.
All right, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for the viewers for tuning in. Thanks for Joe for listening to me yap about my team for a half an hour. Hopefully, we're never going to have to do this again. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Please check out all the posts on Instagram, the college football stuff, and we'll see you next time.